Welcome to Smart Health Talk with your host, Elaine McFadden.
Welcome everyone to Smart Health Talk radio show. And I'm here with Dr. Stephanie Seneff, and she is an MIT researcher, and she is going to give us some great information today about Roundup glyphosate. And what Stephanie specializes in is she actually takes data and analyzes it in different ways than maybe other people have analyzed it, and looks at it with different eyes as well. And so she was able to secure information from Monsanto had done back several years ago, and I'll let her explain that to you. But she was able to take that data and look at it in a different way and bring us some conclusions that I think are very, very important to all of us, because it's actually showing us the true toxicity and risk that is associated with this glyphosate and Roundup as a whole. And I want to just get right down to it and introduce Dr. Seneff here. Welcome.
Hi, I'm
Dr.
so happy
Seneff.
to be
Welcome
here.
to Smart Health Talk.
Thank you.
Okay, why don't you go ahead and tell us what your position is at MIT, what kind of things you do there,
Okay.
and how you got this research, because I think it's more like research that was buried
Yes.
and not really readily available to people.
Right.
And tell us how you got that research, and I'd like to know what you thought when you first took a look at it.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me tell you about myself. I'm
Okay.
a senior research scientist at MIT. I've been at MIT all my life, starting with undergraduate there. So I have all my degrees from MIT, bachelor's in biology with a minor in nutrition and food science, master's, EE degree, and PhD degrees, all in computer science and electrical engineering. So I spent a long time getting educated at MIT many years ago. Since then, I've been working at MIT, and I love the place. I've been doing, for most of my career, working on developing computer systems that allow computers to communicate with humans using natural speech. So dialogue systems for interacting with the computer. It was about 8 years ago that I changed really my career emphasis towards biology, back towards biology, actually, from my roots. I love biology, and I was motivated by my concerns about autism, because the autism rates are rising alarmingly in this country with an exponential growth. I predict that by 2032, half the children born, 80% of the boys, will be on the autism spectrum if we stay the course. That's the curve. So I think it's an emergency, and that's why I'm sort of pulling out all stops to try to get the message out. What I see very clearly is glyphosate. I think that it is a key factor in not only autism, but many, many other diseases and conditions, chronic conditions, that we are putting up with today because of the chronic poisoning that we're receiving in our food supply, and also in the water and in the air from this pervasive toxic chemical.
Because it's basically everywhere right now.
It's really hard to avoid. It's impossible to avoid. Even people who are eating organic test positive for glyphosate in the urine. And that's in Europe. I'm sure it's worse here because we consume 25% of the world's market of glyphosate with only 5% of the population. So we love glyphosate in this country, and it's killing us, in my opinion, or certainly causing us to be very, very ill.
Right. And so we get a lot of the research that we're getting nowadays, I feel, is more controlled by Monsanto. They don't allow other people outside of Monsanto to do research their products. Is that true?
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, they basically are sure to fund, they're careful to make sure that they give plenty of money to all the agricultural schools. And then that funding comes with strings attached to it. And people sort of know not to go near their products to try to prove. No one wants to build their career on proving that Monsanto's product is toxic, because that's just cutting the arm that feeds you. And I think that's a huge problem. I think they control the research, and and anyone who tries to do the research, and usually doing it on a shoestring budget, they attack. So why would some young person starting out choose a career path that's going to lead to destruction? I can see why people aren't, but it's amazing to me that people should rise to the occasion. They should see that what we're going to do is destroy the next generation if we keep this up. I mean, it's so urgent that people have to step out of line and take that risk, in my opinion, if we have any hope for the future generations. I feel we're in an emergency situation.
Well, Dr. Seralini, he did that.
He was great. I love him. And in fact, I'm going to have a chance to meet him soon. So I'm really excited about that.
I would be too.
For the first time. I mean, I've been reading all of his work. He's done wonderful, wonderful work. He gets his funding from, some of his funding comes from the people who are against the GMOs, which should be perfectly fine, because after all the other funding comes from the people who are pro-GMO, But he's got, he's a good example because he published a seminal paper. I thought at the time that it was the only study that had ever been done, a long-term study on rats exposed to glyphosate throughout their lifespan. Turns out I was wrong, and I didn't know this until only recently when Anthony Samsel and I started looking at the actual early Monsanto data. Monsanto had done lifetime studies of rats and mice back in the 1970s. Those were the studies that were labeled secret. So they managed to get the EPA to agree to label these studies secret and to hide them from the public so that people couldn't scrutinize them. I mean, I find that really, truly amazing that they could do that. And they also learned never again to do those long-term studies. They made new rules that said, you only need to go for 3 months. 3 months is enough time to show toxicity. Well, in fact, Seralini didn't see anything until 4 months. So it looks to me like they did those long-term studies. They saw cancer as well. They saw statistically significant incidence of cancer in those studies. And they found it in small doses. So glyphosate is an endocrine disruptor. Endocrine disruptors are now well known to be peculiar in that they're more toxic in small doses than they are in larger doses.
That was actually one of my questions.
Yeah, so it was amazing.
I read that and I was like, wow, because people are thinking this dose relationship.
The dose makes the poison. The dose makes the poison. And they say that. They try to get you to think that the dose makes the poison. So they think as long as it's small doses, don't worry about it. But that is not true with an endocrine disruptor, which glyphosate definitely is.
Well, so what should we think when we hear an acceptable dose? There's only small traces of residue of a pesticide.
I don't think there's an acceptable dose. I think the acceptable dose is 0. I think we should remove the product from the, I'm serious, remove it.
I agree.
Stop making it, because we're not just destroying our own health. We're destroying all these animals. We're destroying the earthworms in the soil. We're destroying the soil itself, and we're causing climate change. Glyphosate is a significant contributor to the climate change problems that we face. So, I mean, it's just like there's no excuse for putting this chemical on the planet.
Well, we had Rodale Institute on our show, and we talked about their white paper where their research had shown a direct correlation between organic no-till agriculture and the amount of carbon in the air, where current conventional practices are adding to the carbon, where organic no-till actually reverses.
That's right. That's right. And in fact, putting the cows back on the pasture would be the right thing to do, because in Argentina, it's so sad because they had grass-fed beef. That was their main commodity way back when. And we kind of coerced them into converting into this GMO Roundup Ready soy. They converted all their grass fields into GMO Roundup Ready soy. Now they have a huge problem with all kinds of horrible problems with their children, major diseases and cancer and various weird pathologies, and born with no brain, anencephaly, all kinds, or their stomach outside of their body. All kinds of weird stuff.
It's very disturbing.
It's very disturbing what's happening to them. And I think it's glyphosate that's doing that. I mean, many other chemicals as well, but I think glyphosate is far, far bigger a contributor to all of these problems than we realize. We've been taught this stuff is safe. It's at the hardware store. You put it on your grass to kill the weeds. You put it on your lawn, on your walkways, you kill the weeds. So great, non-toxic. We've been taught that, and it is a lie. And it's just scary to me to think of a pregnant woman going down to the hardware store, getting some Roundups, herself, applying it to her weeds. If she's in her early pregnancy applying Roundup to her weeds, she could end up with an autistic child just because of that, I think. Now, I haven't proven it, but the evidence that I'm accumulating is stronger and stronger every day.
So when you got this evidence, you were able to secure hidden evidence
Yes, and I must say it was Anthony who did this, and he's a hero in my mind because of it. I really enjoy working with Anthony. We've published 4 papers together so far, and we're working on a 5th one. And he's amazing. He's a farmer, and he grows organic food to feed his family. He's a chemist. He's a retired expert in pathology. He worked for many years at Arthur D. Little as a chemist, and he has many patents to his name. He's really brilliant, and he's a feister. I mean, he's a feisty fighter, and he will not stand down to Monsanto, and I really respect him for that. He had to really go through multiple rounds of requests with the EPA to finally get them to agree to give him these documents that Monsanto had declared secret.
So they were in some file at the EPA somewhere.
Yeah, and they forced him to sign a document that said he wouldn't show them to anybody. So I have not seen them. He has honored that. And he tells me his lawyers have told him that's not legal for them to do that, but that's what they did. They forced him to sign a document that said he would not share them with anybody. So he's got these stacks of 10,000 pages of stuff that he's been rummaging through to get the data out of Monsanto's early studies, which supposedly proved that glyphosate is safe. And he found contrary evidence in those studies. And what was they did some good studies back then, actually, much, much more thorough than the studies that they did after that time. And one study in particular that I was fascinated with was where they exposed rodents, I forget if it was rats or mice, maybe both, to glyphosate that was radioactively labeled glyphosate, so they could trace where it went. That's really a great thing to do, and they found part of it went into the bone marrow.
Right?
Yeah, and where does it go, and it went into the bone marrow, which is really scary because it's very difficult to get it out of the bone marrow, first of all. And secondly, it can do tremendous damage there. That's where precursor cells,
the stem cells, every cell in our body, right?
Exactly so. They're the cells that are going to renew our tissues when they die. They're going to renew our red blood cells, our white blood cells, our immune system. And
a stem cell can become any cell in the body.
That's right. And so, messing with those is not a good idea. That's how you can get things like leukemia, I would think. And of course, glyphosate has been linked to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and also multiple myeloma. In farmers exposed to it. So
this accumulation, explain, because that's one of the things that really got me about that particular study was that it was demonstrating that this is accumulating in our body. And I think people are thinking that we're metabolizing this on a regular basis, and somehow it's like going in and like somehow disappearing. And when I read that, I thought, oh my gosh, this is very significant that it's actually accumulating in our bodies.
That's right. And in fact, the story that they tell, this lovely story, first of all, it breaks down very quickly in the soil. That's not true. It can last for 20 years in the soil under certain conditions. Secondly, it goes through the body very quickly and is expelled through the urine, through the feces. None of it accumulates. That's a story, right? It's wrong. It's incorrect. And in fact, part of the glyphosate gets converted in the body to nitrosyl glyphosate, which is a very, very potent carcinogenic agent. And, we haven't studied it at all. We know that nitrososarcosine is very toxic. That's a derivative product of glyphosate.
But if glyphosate
itself,
that shocked me, Dr. Seneff, because I thought when we're metabolizing glyphosate, we're actually creating a new toxin within our bodies.
Right. Yes, that's worse than glyphosate. And how much worse, I don't know. But really, I can't imagine, because nitrososarcosine is known to be toxic. And that's almost the same thing. I mean, glyphosate's worse because glyphosate's much more toxic than sarcosine. So you have to, you can figure that out. Really scary stuff. And so animal studies have shown in chickens and in cows, they've shown that it shows up in all the organs, in the liver, the lungs, actually. In the cows, the lungs had the highest amount. And Monsanto studies showed that radiocarbon showed up in the carbon dioxide that was exhaled in the breath. So these animals are eating the glyphosate. It's going into their lungs, and in their lungs, it's getting metabolized to carbon dioxide. That means their lungs are being exposed to glyphosate. And we have an epidemic right now in COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and asthma. These things, I think, are directly connected.
These are horrible diseases, and they're very expensive too.
Right, exactly.
Very expensive. And like with COPD, the only hope you have is like a lung transplant.
it's really scary. It's a terrible disease, and chronic, and it just causes you to, have to be on oxygen all the time. It's not pleasant.
One question I had when I read that was because of the nitrate,
Hmm.
it binds with nitrates. I was wondering, like I knew many, many years ago not to eat nitrate, bacon and products, luncheon meats and that had the nitrates in them. And thank goodness I avoided those. But I was wondering if people that are eating products with nitrates in them, together with the glyphosate, if that increases their risk of creating more of this toxin.
I would imagine that it would. Yes, I think you're probably right. I've been extensively studying nitrogen. It's very, very interesting, various nitrogen oxides and what they do. What I'm seeing, actually, what appears to me to be happening is that glyphosate induces the production of both formaldehyde and ammonia in the gut. Ammonia, of course, is nitrogen with hydrogen. It's just nitrogen and hydrogen. Those are it's a reduced form of nitrogen. Ammonia oxidizes into nitrogen oxides, including nitrous oxide, which is actually nasty because it'll disable cobalamin B12, vitamin B12. So vitamin B12 deficiency can cause things like dementia. And so you can just put that together and figure if you're producing ammonia in your gut because of glyphosate, you could easily be causing dementia.
And I would think vegetarians would be at even greater risk because they're getting a lower intake of B12 just by their
Right.
diet.
Absolutely. You already have a risk for B12 deficiency if you're a vegetarian.
And that B12 is critical for in the digestive process as well, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Cobalamin is a
And
very,
breakdown
very
of proteins.
very important molecule. I actually think it plays a role in the synthesis of sulfate, which is my area of expertise, and sulfate is very, very important for the body's health. So I think cobalamin deficiency would disrupt that.
Now, I was also doing some reading about the glycine.
Mm-hmm.
And I found it very interesting about, because we were just talking about dementia, so it's kind of like taking me to that space. And I was wondering if you could explain to me how these neurotransmitters are working, and with the glyphosate, and there's a blocking that happens, and I'm wondering, does that blocking happen that actually helps us process thoughts because it slows down this excitogen type of response that we have? And I was trying to understand it with my brain here that isn't quite as advanced as yours on all this, and I was wondering, could you explain how all that's working, because this is related to many other diseases that have to do with our brain, like epilepsy, and I'm thinking MS, and like you said, dementia, Alzheimer's. So can you explain that a little bit on how glyphosate figures into all that?
Yeah, well, actually, I've done some digging around on the whole issue of glycine and glutamate and their role in exciting So they basically are excitatory neurotransmitters. And there's a category of receptors called NMDA receptors. And those guys, if they are triggered, your neurons will get so excited they'll burn themselves out if there's too much NMDA receptor activity. And glyphosate, so NMDA receptors actually need a lot of stuff to happen in order to get excited. And glyphosate you can be convinced that glyphosate would cause all of those things to happen. And so basically glutamate is going to be in excess because glyphosate chelates manganese, which is a mineral that is crucial for converting glutamate to glutamine. So
explain what chelation means to people that aren't familiar.
It basically puts a cage around it so that it's not accessible to the body. So it hides the mineral inside a cage of glyphosate cage. And so manganese deficiency is something that really I've done, and Anthony and I have a whole paper on that. And all the ramifications of manganese deficiency. What was striking to us was, I had been studying autism for a long time, and I saw all these things that are associated with autism, which it turns out can be explained very easily on the basis of manganese deficiency. And one of those is excess glutamate in the brain, which is that's well known that that's an excitotoxin to the brain. It's in excess because the astrocytes are not able to clear it. In order to clear it, they have
So
to
you've
convert it to
ruined this
glutamate.
balance that we normally
Yeah, they
have in our
can't clear it
brain.
because there's not manganese. And they need the manganese in order to be able to clear the glutamate. So the glutamate builds up and causes to toxic levels. And it works synergistically with glycine. So glycine and glutamate both have to be present to get these NMDA receptors to fire. But glyphosate can act as a glycine mimetic and replace the glycine in the receptor. So glycine works together with the glutamate that it allows to exist, and together they cause these NMDA receptors to overfire. And this kind of excess glutamate and NMDA receptor firing are associated with autism and Alzheimer's, and probably other neurological diseases as well.
Now, since we're on the topic of chelation, manganese isn't the only mineral that is
No.
being chelated by glyphosate. Things like folic acid and calcium as well, right?
Yeah, now folic acid is not a mineral. It's not being chelated, but
Right,
folic
it's a
acid
B
is
vitamin.
definitely getting messed up by glyphosate. This is something I've really studied recently. I gave a whole 1 hour talk on folic acid at the recent Western Price meeting, and very, very interesting topic. Turns out folate, which is the correct form of folic acid, the healthy form, folate, is found in various, dark green vegetables, also liver and various kinds of meat and products. But folate is fragile. It easily breaks down with cooking, which may be one of the reasons why raw is so useful. People talk a lot about raw food, eating raw food, because that will keep it from getting broken down, among other vitamins as
And
well.
I know that prenatal vitamins, that's one of the main
Yes.
vitamins that you want to get because it's so critical to the developing fetus.
Yes, you're right. Folic acid is now pretty much, I think, prescribed to pregnant women, especially in the first trimester of pregnancy, with the goal of avoiding spina bifida and other problems of the neurotube development project, including anencephaly, being born without a brain. And that's interesting because anencephaly is actually, I think, a consequence of glyphosate poisoning.
And you said that in Brazil that they're seeing a lot of that in the
They're seeing
births.
that, yes, and other kinds of obvious defects in the neurotube development. There was an epidemic of anencephaly that in eastern Washington State, around a waterway where they had been using a lot of those 2 years in which they had an epidemic in anencephaly, they had been using glyphosate extensively in the waterways to control the weeds. So it was getting into the water supply, and it was causing these children to be born without a brain. Really, really tragic result. But because of that, it's interesting the timing, because in 1996 was when there was this committee meeting that was formed. They started to discuss this idea of requiring folic acid fortification in the wheat-based products in order to make sure that the entire, yes, in bread in this country. And you probably know that Europe doesn't do it, right? Europe does not require folic acid in the bread, and there are a lot of people.
This is almost like a silent conspiracy, really. It's like they
I
know there's a relationship here, so we're going to cover up the fact that we've created this problem by adding it to the bread.
You're a quick study. You got it. Because what I think happened, I think there must have been someone among those people who were deciding to do this who knew that glyphosate is going to cause spina bifida. And they were seeing that the rates were going up, and they wanted to hide that signal because it's very clear. You can easily see that spina bifida rates are going up. You will not miss that signal. And so they thought, if we just put folic acid all over the place, we will, keep this from happening, and we can hide this effect. I can't prove that they knew that, but it's suspicious because it was the same timing when they introduced the GMO Roundup Ready crops, 1996. 1998 was when they made it official, fortification of the flower. And that was when they really had launched these crops. They were growing very fast at that point. So we were getting a fast increase in exposure to glyphosate over that same period. Turns out the folic acid is not a good solution, and that's what I talked about in my talk, because folic acid is not a natural form of folate. It's a synthetic form. It's oxidized, and it doesn't have the methyl group. So it costs the liver a lot to convert it into the right form. And
where we get folate in food, which you said was the
what
ideal.
You eat in food is the healthy form. But if you take folic acid, especially if you take a lot of folic acid supplements, it can actually backfire, and it can cause folate deficiency in the brain. And that's because the liver is overwhelmed with all that folic acid. It says, I can't convert this stuff. I'm just going to let it go. So the folic acid goes into the blood. It goes to the brain, and it binds to the receptors, the folate receptors, and it blocks the folate from getting in. So ironically, you think you're taking lots of folic acid to keep yourself safe, and you're actually doing the reverse. You're causing cerebral folate deficiency, which is really bad because that's linked to autism.
Wow.
So it's very, very interesting. And so I think the folic acid is part of the reason why people are allergic to wheat these days. I think it's the combination of the glyphosate in the wheat, because the wheat is sprayed with glyphosate right before the harvest, and the folic acid in the wheat, both of them together.
And can you explain that's called desiccation? How do you say that word?
Desiccation, right.
Desiccation, yeah. And can you explain, because I think people are just under the perception that GMOs and Roundup are what we're mostly using it on, except that they're pushing people to use that around their homes.
Yes.
But, they think that it's just on those crops and that Roundup isn't used on any other crops. But I was really, really curious. I've been dying to ask you this. When they're using for this purpose right before harvest, how much of that Roundup is ending up in the wheat or the legume? There was it's used on lentils and what
and
other kind of crops?
Sugarcane.
Oh, okay.
Which is huge, because that's a huge
Is it sugar
percentage.
beets or just sugar cane?
Sugar beets are GMO Roundup ready.
Okay,
and
those are already
sugar cane
getting
is
it.
sprayed with Roundup right before the harvest. And of course, then you have high fructose corn syrup, which is another popular cheap fruit.
And that was causing a bunch of problems too.
GMO Roundup ready corn. So all three of those are most likely going to be contaminated with glyphosate. And I think that's why sugar is toxic. I mean, we've heard so much lately about how sugar is toxic and we have to avoid sugar. Sugar is actually a really good fuel. Our bodies would ordinarily be well equipped to deal with sugar. We've really worked that out. Sugar is it's a very fast fuel. We understand how to do. We got the insulin. We can metabolize it very quickly in the mitochondria. It's actually a good fuel.
And actually, sugar cane, when you eat it, it does have a lot of nutrition in it. I know. I'm with you on that, Dr. Seneff, because it's hard for me to say that sugar is bad, because I just really don't completely believe that. And I think when you're growing it organically,
absolutely,
and you're not, in healthy soil, and you're not adding all these pesticides, and of course the processing, part of it is an influence as well. Sugar. But it's hard for me to say that, and I use sugar. I use organic sugar in my coffee in the morning. I don't eat a lot of sugar because I don't eat a lot of sweet type products, but I have some honey and sugar because they're the combination in my coffee, along with the Strauss organic whipping cream, and that's the ultimate to me. But I'm not going to say, I can't go around telling people like sugar is bad, but I will tell them that conventional sugar is bad. But I never really fully believe that. So can you explain, how much residue, how they actually use the Roundup, why they're using that before harvest, and then what you suspect, what the kind of residue that would be left on that? Because I've had people tell me, oh, that's not a problem because it's going on, the hull is removed, and with that, most of the pesticide is being removed. And so I'd like your opinion on that. And then after that, if we could kind of get into a little bit about the high fructose corn syrup and what's happening in our body with this high fructose corn syrup. There's byproducts that are happening as a result of that too. So go ahead and first of all, just tell us, why are they spraying these crops before they harvest them?
I know. I have to say I was shocked myself, because, and this is when Anthony and I decided to do this paper on, we did another paper on gluten intolerance. So we did one on manganese and the one on cancer. The original one was just generic. And then the fourth one was on gluten intolerance. And I was puzzled when I was seeing all this, gluten intolerance, and I was thinking, I wonder if that's related to glyphosate. And I was thinking, well, it's not GMO, probably not, So then I did some digging around, and I was really shocked when I found out that there's a new, a growing popularity of a practice of spraying the wheat with glyphosate just a few days before the harvest, with the intention of killing the wheat. So the wheat is not GMO Roundup ready. It does die in response to the glyphosate, but they want it to die because they want to reduce the amount of residue they need to clear to get ready for next year's crop.
So they want the whole wheat plant to die, really. So when they come with the tractor, there's not all these tall plants to deal with. Is that it?
Exactly. That's part of it, and then also to get to go to seed so that it synchronizes the harvest. So you can increase the yield by getting it all synchronized, all of it going to seed at the same time. In the north, it's especially important to get the crop to beat the weather, because if you get facing a winter and the snow's about to come, you could lose the whole crop. So they want to force it to ripen so they can harvest it before the frost. And then also you can get a head start on next year's weeds, because you're basically killing the weeds at the same time as you're killing the plant, and get a pure ground to start for next year. So those are all the reasons that are, fairly reasonable. And of course, since glyphosate is completely non-toxic to humans, there shouldn't be any problem with that.
Right.
That's the attitude. And it goes into the seed.
It is going into the seed, because they try to say we're removing the hull, and with that, the pesticide is going bye-bye too. But you're saying, no, it's penetrating, because actually there was, is it chloride that they add that actually makes it penetrate, the glyphosate penetrate even deeper?
Well, they add these additional adjuvants that make it, and surfactants that make the glyphosate much, much more toxic to the plants than it would otherwise be. And of course, that also makes it more toxic to us. And the really amazing thing to me is they don't need to show what its toxicity is in the context of the things that they add. They don't even have to tell us what those things are. So when you buy a product, you don't know what's in there. And they're putting stuff in there to make it more toxic to the plants, mostly to allow it to penetrate the cell membrane so that it can get into the cell and cause its damage. So it amazes me that the EPA thinks that's fine, that they should only, they actually have a policy that they should only test these chemicals in isolation. And then whatever tests are done by other people that are doing on the product, they dismiss those, because that's not the chemical in isolation.
Yeah, and just to kind of explain that a little bit, that's, because we've been talking about glyphosate. And glyphosate is this active ingredient that's in Roundup. And what you were just talking about, that along with glyphosate are all these other chemicals added to the Roundup product that are surfactants and other chemicals that make it more toxic to the plant and more permeable through the cell membrane.
Yes, and
they're toxic.
It's shocking to me. They're toxic in and of themselves, and people have shown 1,000-fold more toxicity of the product compared to the individual isolated component. People like Saralini have shown that. It's just amazing to me that the EPA thinks there's no problem with that scenario where you say, well, we tested it in isolation, it was fine, and therefore we can put whatever other things into the product and go ahead and release it on the naive public, using us as guinea pigs, basically.
I kept wondering about the wheat too, Dr. Seneff, because I kept thinking, I know they're doing something to that wheat. I don't know what they're up to, but they haven't genetically modified it, but I know they're doing something to that wheat. They're playing around with it, and I kept thinking that that whole wheat white bread, I was like, hey, I've made whole wheat bread from scratch before, it's like a friggin' brick, right? I'm like, how are you making whole wheat into, this fluffy, light kind of product? And they're adding other chemicals as well, and I'm wondering if this process where they're spraying the Roundup before harvest is actually adding to the softening of the wheat in some way to create this other product. I don't know that.
No, I don't know about that.
Yeah, I don't know about that either, but to me that's
But what we talked about
fishy.
in our paper is that the glyphosate, just judging from its chemical reactivity, you can expect it to get in the way of a reaction that takes place in the body to digest the wheat. So it actually prevents you from digesting the wheat, and it binds to the wheat. And then your immune system recognizes this toxic product, which is a glyphosate wheat combo, and it develops an immune reaction to the wheat. I think this is what is happening with a lot of our allergies. We have an epidemic in peanut allergy right now, which might also be due to a reaction to whatever toxic chemicals are in the peanut, because they use a lot of toxic chemicals on the peanuts.
I wondered about that.
Yeah, I don't know specifically glyphosate. I believe so, but I'm not sure. They might even use glyphosate as a burn down on the peanuts, as a desiccant. I need to check that. They might.
Yeah, that would be interesting to know.
And that might explain.
Because the EpiPens at schools now, I know that I talked to someone and they used to have like a couple of EpiPens kept in the nurse's office. And now they have something like, 2,000 EpiPens. I mean, it's just insanity on what's happening here with the allergies, as you were talking about. Now, I'd like to know if that relates back to the, pretty much the attack on gut bacteria, because our gut
Yes.
bacteria are just like, they are so important. And that's why,
Right.
I tell women, please breastfeed your child, because especially that initial breast milk, it's just full of all these
Right.
immunoglobulins. It's like, to me, the greatest gift you could ever give your baby. And,
Absolutely.
and that all comes back down to the gut bacteria. And then we take antibiotics. And
Hmm.
I read one study where even after a year, your gut bacteria was not back to normal. And I wonder if it ever really gets back to normal, that you could be killing off bacteria that never come back. And even when
Right.
we take these probiotics, it's just kind of a hit and miss kind of thing. I tell people take
Yes.
a lot of different probiotics, because they're
Yes.
different strains. And why not introduce a bunch of different strains into your gut?
Right. No, you're absolutely right. The gut microbes are really, really suffering, and glyphosate is a big part of that problem. I really believe that. Glyphosate is actually patented as an antimicrobial agent. It kills a lot of different microbes, and it also preferentially kills the good guys, especially the lactobacillus, who really depend upon manganese. And glyphosate makes
Manganese,
manganese
here we're talking
unavailable.
about manganese again, and you said it was chelated by glyphosate.
Yes, so the lactobacillus use manganese very heavily as for antioxidant protection, and they will suffer, and they're supposed to really take hold in the gut to chase out the bad guys, the pathogens. So when lactobacillus can't grow, that gives the pathogens an opportunity, and you end up with all these issues with Pseudomonas aeruginosa and C. difficile, all these epidemics we're seeing in these intractable multiple antibiotic resistant bugs. Um, Studies have shown that a chronic exposure, low dose exposure to one antibiotic, can cause your microbes to develop the pathogens to develop resistance to multiple other antibiotics, and that's why I think part of the reason why we have an epidemic, which we do right now, a severe problem in multiple antibiotic resistant infections at the hospital that just cannot be cured. You throw the kitchen sink at it and it won't die. Glyphosate is essentially a low dose chronic exposure to an antibiotic. And so I think that we're all getting that. The cows, of course, are getting that as well. They're getting antibiotics that they're giving them to fatten them up on top of the glyphosate, which is
And how does
also
that work? How do the antibiotics add pounds onto a farm animal? And is it
that's
doing
not
that
something
to us too? The same
yeah,
mechanism?
no, that's a good question, and I unfortunately don't have the answer to that one. I would love to know
Okay.
myself. I haven't
Yeah,
figured
that's one I've wondered for a while.
I haven't figured that one out.
We'll have to
Yeah,
look
and
that one up.
glyphosate is also making us fat, I think. When you look at the obesity epidemic, it hit a corner. We were going up slowly in our country as a whole. Statistically, was going up in obesity slowly up until 1975. And at 1975, there's a corner, and we start going up much faster. Our weight, our obesity problem starts going up much faster. In 1975, that's when glyphosate was introduced into the food chain. And when you look at, you can look at statistics from the CDC, and you look at obesity versus glyphosate, you see a very good match. The increase in obesity correlates very strongly with the increase in glyphosate usage on corn and soy crops, and the increase in diabetes as well. And I think they're connected, and I think they're both linked to glyphosate. And you had mentioned the fructose. I want to get back to the fructose, which we
Yeah,
kind of
I was
dropped.
thinking that too. We're in sync here.
We're all over the place here, but
No,
there's so
I
many
know. I
things.
think this is great.
Really interesting topic. So the fructose is very interesting, and then Anthony and I talked about it quite a bit in our recent paper on cancer, because what was really intriguing to me was the phosphoenol pyruvate, which is a product of fructose. Fructose is converted into PEP, and PEP is the input to the pathway that glyphosate disrupts. That's called the shikimate pathway. That's a biological pathway. PEP is the first thing that goes into that pathway, and glyphosate blocks that first step. So what happens is, first of all, the products of that pathway don't get made. That's a serious problem, because those are the aromatic amino acids, and they're precursors to all kinds of important biological molecules. But on top of that, the PEP is going to build up because it's blocked. It can't go where it needs to go. The body wants to make more PEP to try to force it through that pathway that's broken. When you have elevated PEP, it changes the way fructose is metabolized. and starts causing the body to convert fructose into really, really toxic agents like methylglyoxal. So methylglyoxal is an incredibly potent glycating agent, which is going to cause damage to hemoglobin. You talk about hemoglobin A1C, which people measure to see if they have diabetes. Methylglyoxal is going to cause hemoglobin A big time, because it's going to attack the hemoglobin, and it'll attack other proteins in the blood as well as attacking the
metals.
I know. Just take a drug. No,
but
aren't we lucky?
And is that then related to the fatty liver syndrome?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, yes. And in fact, there's other connections to that as well, because so there's some nice papers that show that glyphosate, and Roundup in particular, disrupts an enzyme called STAR. It's kind of a good name because it's a superstar. It's actually steroidogenic acute regulatory protein, something like that. Yeah, STAR. Never mind, some complicated name.
Hey, I couldn't quote that, so I'm sure glad you can.
So STAR actually allows cholesterol to get into the mitochondria, and in the mitochondria, cholesterol is modified so as to produce all these different important sterols, like the stress hormone cortisol, the sex hormones, estrogen and testosterone and progesterone, and also cholesterol, sulfate, and vitamin D. So all of these things, if you're suppressing STAR, you're going to have trouble making all of those things.
And making babies too, maybe, huh?
Well, there's that. That's right. And in the liver, if you can't make these cholesterol sulfate, you're going to be stuck with impaired bile acid synthesis. And glyphosate also disrupts these cytochrome enzymes that are involved in bile acid synthesis. So there's multiple ways in which glyphosate messes up the liver's ability to produce bile, which is going to flow back to the gut, digest the fats, and provide the gut with all kinds of important nutrients. So lots of the gut is suffering because of the lack of bile acids, but at the same time, the liver is suffering because it can't make these sulfated sterols that would allow it to send those things out. So the cholesterol actually piles up, and the liver then is forced to create these fatty stores of cholesterol and fat in the liver because it can't ship them out through the bile acids. So that's how you get the fatty liver disease.
Okay, and then let's like kind of tie that all into some other great research that you have worked on. I know that I've heard you talk about, this belly fat that we see a lot of, and then also, the cholesterol in our blood, the high LDLs, and we could even get into the skin cancer thing too, but the statins and the risk with statins. And I would love to have you talk a little bit about that, because I've witnessed firsthand the way that doctors are treating patients now when they come in. It's like, for instance, my husband had hip replacement, and of course he hadn't exercised before that. And when he goes in for his first appointment after having the hip replacement, yes, of course he's overweight a little bit, but it wasn't, that bad. We're talking, 20, 25 pounds. And so, before they give him a chance to get a true baseline, to get on an exercise program along with healthy eating and try to find out what is his true baseline, they're immediately pushing the statins. And that was upsetting to me, because I feel like, okay, you're not even giving him a chance to get a true baseline on, does he really need statins or not, and immediately put him on there. And some of the work that you've done on the risks associated with these statins, because it was always kind of crazy to me, because I thought that cholesterol was important for every cell in our body. And I'm thinking, when you're blocking this cholesterol, how do we know you're not blocking the cholesterol that's important for your brain, or some other important cell in your body? And so could you explain that a little bit? Because I think that is just so important right now with the massive, prescriptions being written for these drugs. And they're very expensive too.
Yeah, it's really crazy. I get so upset with the way the doctors push the statins, and they really threaten the patient. If you don't take the statin, I'll go to your funeral. And they really threaten them.
Yes,
they just think
do.
the statin is the only answer.
They give them a printout on like, you've got 3 years to live.
Yeah, they're terrified. The patients feel I have to take this drug or else I'm going to die, and it's just so crazy because the statins, I think, are just almost as bad as the glyphosate. I think they're really, really bad. They're causing so many problems. I essentially would sum it up as they make you grow older faster, and in fact, it's been shown in a recent study that statins disrupt the ability of these mesenchymal stem cells to turn into the cells that they're trying to replace. So when a cell gets broken by just living in the heart, say, then a cell, these stem cells can come in and replace it with a brand new cell. But statins prevent them from doing that. They interfere with that process.
Wow.
And that paper specifically said make you grow older faster, which is something I've been saying for a long time, but I didn't have that explanation until recently. Statins are really bad. I mean, cholesterol is so important for every cell in your body, especially your muscles and your brain. The brain has 25% of the body's cholesterol with only 5% of the body's mass, so it's hugely overpopulated with cholesterol. Very, very important for the neurons, for signaling and all the axons. It's just amazing to me to think that anybody would be crazy enough to take a toxin, basically, that's going to disrupt their liver's ability to make cholesterol. It's just a crazy, crazy idea. I do not understand how they have managed to get the doctors and everybody else on board with this idea that we should be putting statins in the drinking water. I mean, it's just insane.
So what should people think when they see their cholesterol high? Should they be thinking, oh, I should be on an organic diet
They
and
should
getting
be
off
thinking,
glyphosate?
I'm lucky. They should be thinking, I'm lucky. I mean, if you're old, high cholesterol is going to give you longevity. It's going to give you a better brain. It's going to give you a better body. There's a study, 17-year study done on the elderly. Everybody in it was 70, at least 70 at the beginning. And many of them died, of course, in the course of the study. They found that the ones that had the lowest cholesterol had the worst prognosis, both in terms of physical frailty and mental decline, and they died sooner. So, it's just a myth. The thing is that elevated cholesterol is a direct consequence of glyphosate poisoning, I think. And as again, with the liver, I told you the liver can't make the bile acids, which is normally the way it would have distributed cholesterol as cholesterol sulfate, through the bile acids, sending it to the gut, putting it into the chylomicron, sending it back to the body via the lymph system directly to the heart. The heart gets first dibs on that cholesterol sulfate that comes out of the gut from the liver, and the heart loves it. The heart wants that cholesterol sulfate to keep it healthy. And so heart disease is actually a consequence of sulfate deficiency. And what happens is that the heart is actually like a squirrel stashing nuts. It's putting extra cholesterol into the artery walls of the major arteries feeding the heart in order to have a supply ready whenever sulfate's available. And as soon as there's sulfate, that cholesterol gets shipped out as cholesterol sulfate to deliver it to the heart.
Well, please explain how sunscreens are figuring into this whole equation as well, because I found that when I listened to you explain that, it just like a light bulb went off, and I was like, that makes total sense, because for a long time now, I've seen a risk associated with sunscreens, particularly with vitamin D, people, because I do believe that there is a safe sun window there where sun is part of life. It has been for our total evolution. But these sunscreens are blocking more than vitamin D. So, and it connects with this whole cholesterol sulfate need for our body, and how that could relate to elevated LDL.
Yes, great question. I am an absolute sun worshiper. And in fact, if you look at, there's a lovely paper that showed an exact inverse relationship in around the world in countries. If you looked at the amount of sun availability, how much rain and how many sunny days they got as a function of time, and you looked at the population and how much heart disease they had, it was a complete inverse relationship. The ones who got the most sun had the least heart disease. And I think that it doesn't make sense that animals would not evolve a mechanism to make use of that wonderful energy that's available in that sun every day. And so we have developed a whole mechanism through cholesterol sulfate, I believe, to capture the energy in the sunlight and use it for our own purposes. So it's really fascinating when the body is exposed to sunlight. The red blood cells, the endothelial cells lining the artery walls, the skin cells, they all get busy making cholesterol sulfate. And then that cholesterol sulfate is then distributed throughout the body, and very, very, very important for health, in my opinion. And so the
LDL, we actually could have an elevated, because I started thinking, because your body is just so smart. It knows what's going
Yeah.
on. And if you're depriving it of sunlight, so it's not getting the cholesterol sulfate from that sunlight source, and it's
Hmm.
dependent on the cholesterol sulfate that can be made in the body, it's going to go, okay, we're not getting any in the skin. So we have to, like you said, store up and be ready
Yes.
in an instant, because your heart doesn't beat, you're a goner. So,
Yeah.
you start kind of, like it kind of reminds me of a squirrel, storing nuts for the winter in a way.
Yes, exactly.
And so
I
it
think of it
starts
that way.
it starts like putting this cholesterol sulfate in the LDL, because the LDL is kind of the storage mechanism for cholesterol sulfate. Is that correct?
The LDL is shipping the cholesterol around and delivering it to the body. It doesn't have enough of the sulfate, so you need the sulfate to be able to really finish the job, and that's why you end up with high LDL. HDL is actually the one that goes to the skin and picks up all the cholesterol sulfate that the skin
Oh,
has
it
been
does.
producing. HDL,
Oh.
and so when HDL is high, that's a good sign that you've got a lot of skin cells making cholesterol sulfate, and then the HDL can deliver it to the heart. So, but the LDL is actually sort of if you have high LDL, I think it's an indicator, direct indicator of low sulfate, because that's going to be the balance between the HDL and the LDL. High LDL, the liver is producing LDL and shipping it out instead of producing cholesterol sulfate and sending it through the bile acids. Because the liver needs to send its cholesterol out somehow, because that's what it needs to do. It knows it has to get that cholesterol out. And if it can't get it out through the bile acids, it's going to ship it out through LDL particles.
And another option for people that maybe don't even have access to sunlight is Epsom salts. Is that a
Yes,
good
I
thing?
recommend Epsom salts. I think it's great, especially if you've got a natural hot spring, sulfur hot springs. That's so perfect. Those are hard to find. Um, but certainly you can just buy Epsom salts, put them in the bath water, make a hot bath, because the infrared heat is actually promotes the body's ability to use the sulfate. So I think the combination of a hot bath and the Epsom salts, which is magnesium sulfate, is a great way to get sulfate delivered right through the skin. That bypasses all the complexity of the gut, because you can run into trouble with the gut, especially if you've been exposed to glyphosate. Your gut microbes might reduce the sulfate to hydrogen sulfide gas, and you could get toxic amounts of hydrogen sulfide gas if you have been exposed to glyphosate in the gut for many years. So it's tricky. You can't just eat sulfate to get sulfate.
That's like, to me, it's just fascinating, and I love the fact. Well, my daughter actually worked at a natural mineral hot spring, so we used to go there a lot, and I didn't realize that I was like making cholesterol sulfate while I was in the water too. So now I know, an extra plus. They should advertise that in their promotions. Come here to
Yeah.
make cholesterol sulfate. Dr.
And
Seneff
I want to say
recommends
something more
it.
about vitamin D too, because the vitamin D is activated in the liver by these cytochrome enzymes that glyphosate disrupts. And we have a tremendous epidemic in vitamin D deficiency right now today. And it's funny, the doctors just say, oh, everybody's deficient. Here's a vitamin D pill, just take this pill. That's not the right answer at all. Because that's just going to overload your liver with vitamin D that it has to activate. Just like the folic acid, you get too much vitamin D to activate, distracts the
And
liver from
not
the
all
other
these vitamins
things.
are created equal, are they, Dr.
No, not at
Seneff?
all. No,
People
absolutely. And of
think
course,
that they're taking, and they maybe want to save money, and they buy a cheaper version,
right.
and they don't realize that that's actually more of a negative than a positive. Could you kind of explain a little bit about the synthetic forms, and then also, I was wondering if you could explain the other things that vitamin D does in our body.
Yeah, well, what I want to say, first of all, is that when your body makes vitamin D through sunlight, it's also making cholesterol sulfate. And to some extent, I think the vitamin D is a messenger that's telling your body, hey, look, guys, we've got cholesterol sulfate, because it goes together with the cholesterol sulfate. If you simply take a vitamin D supplement, you're not taking sulfate at all. You're just taking vitamin D, and you're not getting cholesterol
Because a lot
sulfate.
of things work hand in hand in our body.
Yeah, you can't just take a vitamin. I don't actually believe in any vitamin supplements, because when you take a vitamin out of context by itself, it's a wrong message. The vitamin comes with stuff. Every time a vitamin is in a particular product, like a leafy green vegetable, there's lots of other stuff in there too. And that part of that vitamin's role, I believe, is a messenger to tell the body, hey, these other things are here. And it's assuming that they're here because it knows it usually comes with those other things. But when you take it out of context and give it as a pill, all of that's gone. You know,
Because
and your
there's a
body might not
synergistic effect in a
yeah, your body
food.
might not even know how to handle it in that context, you know, with just pure, the pure of anything, you know, any particular vitamin.
I
I
think
don't
our
think,
bodies a lot of the times are going, what the heck? You know,
I know, we're
what are
rapidly,
you giving me? What is this stuff?
yeah, we're really struggling to figure out how, our bodies are really struggling to figure out how to cope with all these toxic chemicals that we're exposed to today. It's just insane. When you look at even today versus 100 years ago, just so many novel chemicals that are out there that
How
the
many
body doesn't
chemicals
know
are
how
we
to deal
actually
with.
eating
Oh
today?
gosh, I know. It's amazing. You have to eat your foods as minimally processed as possible. Buy them, you know, whole, cook them yourselves, and use absolutely top-notch ingredients. I mean, that's what we do. It costs you more money, but in the end, you're going to save money because you don't get cancer or heart failure. You know, the diseases you don't get will save you a lot of money if you eat wholesome, organic food. Winning the war.
Well, thank you so much, and please continue your work. And I hope you're gonna come back, and we're gonna be able to have another talk because I got lots of questions for you.
There's lots more to talk about. It's an endless topic.
Okay, all right.
Okay,
Well,
thank
I hope you have a wonderful day and a wonderful holiday, and maybe at the beginning of next year, you know, we can
Right.
come back and continue our conversation.
That would be great.
Okay.